Hey, Tim here, host of the Invisible Condition podcast, a show where we talk about unusually normal things. Now, today's episode is a little bit different. I am joined by the wonderful Miranda Lee, and she teaches meditation techniques to busy people like myself so that we can find that much needed pause in our lives. Now, when you hear that phrase, pause, do you actually take a pause in your life? And if so, what do you do? Is it locking yourself in a room to escape your children? Maybe it's going to the gym. Maybe it's tuning out life and drowning yourself in Netflix or whatever streaming service you're using. But in today's episode, we talk about how self-compassion builds empathy. Now, self-compassion, simply defined, is self-kindness rather than judgment. You know, we all have that inner critic, that voice that comes out that says, you're not doing good. You're not good enough. You're failing. Well, self-compassion is putting that voice to rest. And in this episode, we talk about the importance of how building that self-compassion leads us to empathy. Miranda also gives us a few little tools and techniques at the end of the episode to really practice that technique of building self-compassion. You know, empathy is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. I think we've all been there. We've all done that. But compassion is different. It's the element of wanting to help. However, it's not putting yourself in that other person's shoes. It's that understanding that you are human and all humans suffer, and I want to do something to help. That's what compassion means. And we're going to turn that inward to self-compassion. So stay tuned. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did with Miranda. And as always, what really helps the show and helps us grow is if you head to Instagram and check out Invisible Condition there. Follow us. Also, subscribe to the podcast. Miranda, it is a pleasure to finally connect with you on podcast. We met through your sister, Rosanna.
We did, yes.
Yeah, and Rosanna and I go back a couple years when I was at the digital publication. Rosanna reached out because I wrote an article, and she just gave me a lot of praise, which I was not feeling confident about my writing, and she really helped me really step into that side of myself. And we've now developed a great friendship, and she's also on the Invisible Condition podcast. But it's about you today, and but I'm so thankful for Rosanna and just her dedication and commitment and passion around invisible conditions, and you are as well. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and so I've got your bio, but I would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself. What's what makes you get up every morning and do what you do?
Oh gosh, lots of different reasons. So I'm a meditation facilitator, mindfulness facilitator, and a yoga therapist. I have been practicing both since my teens. My mother used to take me to yoga meditation classes, and I kind of took a deep dive into it in my early 20s when I was going through some challenging times on my master's. I was studying in Ireland at the time with my sister, actually, and struggling with my mental health, with stress and anxiety, and turned back again to yoga and meditation to help me through this challenging time. And it's sort of been there in my life ever since. It's my companion. So it's what I think about, through my day. It's what I love to teach others, and it's what brought me to teaching my community these skills. So I thought I was, okay. So that's probably enough for now, but I can go on for a bit more as well.
Yeah, and I think it's It's fascinating, when we're going through different challenges in life, and there's things that, even like you said, from your childhood, you just could have maybe put aside or forgotten and then brought back. And is that correct? And then that has now kind of formed the work that you do.
I guess so. I'll tell you a little story, which is probably why I started my business, because I run a wellness business in New Jersey, teaching mindfulness and also yoga therapy. So I had this long-term practice of yoga and meditation, like I said, from the time I did my master's in my early 20s onwards. So when I had my children, I thought I was going to be the Zen mom, very cool, very grounded, very earthy. I'd got everything sorted out. I'd worked in advertising for a long time, and I'd used those tools to help me with the stress of that job. So I was like, I got this. And then I had two little boys. I felt totally overwhelmed, totally stressed out. We moved to the suburbs. I didn't know anyone. And that kind of feeling of overwhelm and stress and anxiety came back full on. And I wasn't the parent that I wanted to be. I wanted to be, a happier, more content parent, less overwhelmed. And there was this one aha moment. I'll tell you about it because I think it explains it in a nutshell. So we have very harsh winters sometimes in New Jersey, very cold, snowy. And it was one of those mornings. And I was needing to drop off my kids at daycare to come back and start work. They didn't want to go out. It was really cold. So I was wrangling them into their like snowsuits, which if you've ever tried to do that with a little toddler, it's like trying to dress a monkey. And then I had a baby as well. And somehow I got them outside. I was like, and given them something to eat and put them in their car seats and strapped them in. And I just remember this moment. I just pushed the door to close it. I was just about to drive into the driver's seat. And I just thought, this moment of tremendous overwhelm, I just thought, I just feel like I've done a whole day's work and I've just got my kids into the car. I just don't know how I'm going to do this. Like literally, I was like, I don't know how to do this. And because I had this long-term practice of yoga and meditation, it had kind of trickled out because of the kids, but it was still there in me because I'd been doing it so long. I think I just automatically took a few deep breaths. Whew, yeah, still doing it now. And I walked around my car because I knew that I needed to take a pause. And I guess I did sort of a mindful walk in retrospect because I was coming into the present moment and I was looking around me at the sunshine shining on the snow and that kind of thing. And by the time I got back to the driver's door to start driving away, I felt better. I mean, I didn't feel completely like chilled out, but I felt better enough that I did that every single time I took my kids to daycare and picked them up from then on. And I started having this like daily mindful moment in my life. And it dramatically helped my feelings of overwhelm and stress. And so I started teaching it to other people, like just daily doses of pausing, mindfulness, specifically parents in my community. And then I started teaching some of the kids and the teens because I saw this sense of stress and anxiety was so much part of their life as well. And it sort of has snowballed out from there. And now I teach corporate classes to all sorts of different organizations, also a lot of healthcare. I work in a hospital, healthcare workers and people with in recovery from cancer and other healthcare, health conditions. So yeah, so I guess you're right. This knowing that there are tools out there to soothe myself, soothe my nervous system, developed from teen years, has kind of gone through my life, and it's now what I like to teach other people. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing and sharing so vulnerably because, the topic today, when we were going back and forth and when we first met, we were talking we went off for almost an hour, over an hour, about self-compassion and how that builds empathy for others. And I think when it comes to people with invisible conditions in workplaces who are accommodating people with an illness or disease, we need to talk about that self-compassion. We also need to talk about how does that build empathy. And I just had it in my mind, well, there's self-compassion and then there's empathy. And when we were talking, when we first met, it was, well, self-compassion builds empathy. And so I think that's your story segues nicely into that, because that moment of taking that deep breath, being aware of your surroundings. For me, I'll send up a little prayer and be like, hey, I need to be grounded here, and then continue on with my day, or try to wrangle my two kids, putting a snowsuit on a kid. I live in Vancouver, so it's more like raincoat and rain pants, but still I get that picture. So when we talk about self-compassion or compassion, before we get into that, why don't we define it? What does it mean?
Sure, absolutely. And I think that's a really good question. And I think to separate empathy from compassion and self-compassion as well. So I'll start with empathy. Empathy is really putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So I understand what you're going through. I've been there kind of feeling. And we're sort of set up as human beings to do that. We have a need for connection. Compassion is slightly different. There's an element of wanting to help there that we don't have with empathy. And it's not necessarily I'm putting myself in your shoes. It's more, I understand that you are a human. All humans suffer. And I want to do something to help. And I'm not saying it has to be a huge thing to help. It could even be just sending compassionate thoughts to that person. The word compassion means to suffer with, but it doesn't mean to step into someone else's shoes. So those are two differences. And we'll I think as the conversation comes on, we'll see why those are important differences. And then self-compassion is, and I'm going to use the definition from this wonderful teacher called Kristen Neff. She has set up the Center of Self-Compassion. It's run out of Austin, Texas, and she's a long-term researcher into compassion, self-compassion. Self-compassion is self-kindness rather than judgment. So that inner critic voice that can come out, oh, you're so, why are you doing this? You're failing, all of those things that we all have. We all have an inner critic voice, but instead trying to change that into a more compassionate voice. This is a moment of suffering. This is a moment of difficulty for you. That idea of common humanity rather than isolation. All humans suffer. This is my moment of suffering, but it's not, I'm not alone in that. I'm not isolated in that. And then really importantly, that it's also being mindful about that, mindful about this experience of pain and suffering. Mindfulness is looking at what is here right now in the present moment. So we're not catastrophizing. We're not saying, oh, this moment of suffering, it's like the worst thing that's ever happened to me in my entire life. And we're not saying, that, and we're taking a moment to pause and think about it and bring it into, what it is actually. We're not over-identifying with it. My life is not over because of this thing is happening. There are good and there are bad always in our life. So, and that's the mindful approach.
Thanks for that definition, that explanation. I like that empathy, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. And I think from an invisible condition perspective, when somebody is expressing empathy, sometimes it's hard to relate, because I live with Crohn's, and somebody is being empathetic. Sometimes my mind goes, but you don't know what I'm experiencing. You don't know that fear that I continue to live with because of this illness that I have. But I like that idea of compassion. You want to help. How can I support you? What do you need? I think it also comes to a place of people wanting to know more. And that's really one of the points of this whole project I'm on is Invisible Condition is to educate and help people not only tell stories, not like yourself, help educate, but to drive a deeper understanding of what people with an invisible condition live with. And then how can we take that and transform our societies, our workplaces, and our schools? And so I like that. And then that idea of that self-compassion, right? This is a moment. This suffering will pass. And it might not pass in the way I want it to pass, because I can't control it. So how to live with this and live in that present. Am I getting that correct?
Absolutely. And I think, I think self-compassion, mindful self-compassion is really the understanding that everything changes. It's the quote, there's a meditation teacher I love called Pema Chodron. She says, "You are the sky, everything else is the weather." So, all suffering, all difficulty, all challenge, all joy, all contentment, they're all passing through us. But we're deeper than that. We're at a level deeper than that. And we can hold that space for those, clouds of whatever is passing through us.
Mm-hmm. And so even on our topic, right, building that self-compassion, or that self-compassion helps build empathy for others. So in the context of, let's say, our workplaces, where do we start? We talk a lot about empathy. Leaders need to be empathetic. Leaders need to lead through that lens. But how do we just back that up and start with that piece of self-compassion? I know we were talking a little bit about this before we hit record, and then we paused the conversation because we got to catch this. So I just kind of want to pick that up because I'm really intrigued about specifically in the workplace, because I think that could translate into schools and households and then into society.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to just backtrack a little bit and talk a
Sure.
little bit again about the differences between empathy and compassion and self-compassion, because I think we need to look at that, because I actually don't know if empathetic leadership is what we need. I think what we need is compassionate leadership, and I'll explain why. So, the thing about empathy, jumping into someone else's shoes, is, as you just beautifully put, people don't know what someone else is experiencing, right? Even if I had Crohn's disease, my experience of Crohn's disease might be different to yours, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is, we're more likely to be able to jump into other people's shoes when we think we know what it feels like. So if I did have Crohn's disease, I'll be more empathetic potentially to you, Tim, rather than to someone else who had some other invisible condition like ADHD. So it tunes into those innate biases that we all have. Whereas compassion, where we're not trying to jump into someone else's shoes, but we have that understanding of common humanity, I suffer, they suffer too, allows a little bit more space, especially if we bring in that idea of mindful self-compassion. We work on ourselves to be more compassionate. The mindfulness component allows us to just take a bit of a pause and potentially have some more communication with that person who has the invisible condition, to find out a little bit more about them, right? Empathy, you're more likely to jump in. Oh, I recognize they're suffering. I must do something about it. I don't like that suffering. I suffer too. I want to cure it. I want to do something about it. But that's not always the best thing, right? Oftentimes, taking a moment to pause, I recognize, I'm compassionate. I recognize that this is a moment of suffering for this person, but let me actually ask them what action they require.
I
Let
love
me
that.
have a mindful communication with them and listen. I think that's another thing. Compassion, self-compassion teaches you to listen. Mindfulness teaches you to listen. Um, so action should be taken, but it should be taken after a dialogue, after a pause, after some mindful thinking around what's going on.
Oh, I can tell so many stories of people who, at no fault of their own, they're genuinely great people who have given me so many solutions.
Mm,
My wife lives with a number of invisible conditions, and she feels the same thing. Instead of that mindful dialogue, hey, I see that something's going on. Tell me about it. And see, even just how you ask that is very different than what's going on.
mm.
Hey, I see that something is different in you today. Tell me what's going on. It invites somebody into a conversation rather than kind of shuts down that conversation. And when we approach it with that, putting yourself in somebody's shoes, it's like, oh well, I read about this diet that will help cure X, Y, or Z, or if you do handstands, it might do this. I'm just making that up, but maybe I'm sure there's something out there. But there's, you name it, there's cures for absolutely everything that has no cure. And we're all different. Like you said, if you have Crohn's, I have Crohn's. I might be able to drink 6 cups of coffee a day and be fine. You might take one sip and not be fine. And so we're so different. And I love that compassion, that want to help, but you need to invite someone into a conversation, not push somebody into a conversation, but invite somebody in.
Absolutely. And I think also that element of non-judgment, you recognize this is a moment of difficulty or challenge. You invite someone in for a conversation and you listen without judgment. That's mindful communication, self-compassionate communication. So it's, yeah. And I just thinking, actually, I remember when um, I was involved in planning a event at work, and it was going to be in a bar. It was meant to be a mixer for, to celebrate something that we had achieved. And a member of my team came to me and said, I'm in recovery. I'm sober. This is going to be a very triggering place for me. And I remember thinking, so an empathetic response, because I have other members in my, other people in my life who suffer from addiction. So I could immediately have been putting myself in that person's shoes, and it could have triggered stuff in me. But a more compassionate response would be, okay, so they're telling me this is a moment of difficulty for them. Let's just pause and think about how we can change this up. This is supposed to be a place where we can all mix, where we can all enjoy, where we can all celebrate. This is not going to be the situation for this person. Can we move the venue? Can it be somewhere else that won't be as difficult or challenging? It's little and not so little decisions like that, which I think is where it can work in the workplace. Does that?
Absolutely. I think of that. I've heard stories of that, that same scenario.
Mm,
Um, and I think also about accommodation.
mm,
And so, if you're planning a big company outing and you're going to go on a hike, but somebody has arthritis in their knees or joints and is like, well, I guess I can't go. Does that mean you change the hike, or does that mean there's maybe another element that you could bring in? And so actually that brings up a story. My nephew, who lives with type 1 diabetes,
mm,
14 years old. This kid is like 6'6", size 14. He's huge, big kid. Um, Lives in a small northern British Columbia town, and they were going to go for his teacher was organizing a hike, an overnight hike in the backcountry, no cell service, off the grid. And my nephew, who's, 14-year-old brain, was all excited. Yeah, we're going to go. We're going to have fun. And my sister said he forgot that he lives with diabetes because that's his normal.
Mm-hmm.
But when my sister heard this, she said she became Mama Bear and talked with the teacher and said, well, what happens because there's no cell service? His pump doesn't communicate with his phone. Who's going to check his sugars, every couple hours throughout the night? If he goes low or goes high, how are you going to get him off the mountain? What is the plan? And so there was a lack of that accommodation. And so the teacher at first, to my understanding, there was a little bit of, well, we got this, it should be fine. But my sister had to then had to take it out of that space of empathy and put on that hat of compassion. Like, well, no, like this is what needs to happen. I know you want to help, but because the situation is so dangerous for him, he just can't go. And I understand a few days later, the teacher and my sister had a conversation, and he was upset with himself because he did not approach it with that compassion. He was trying, from my understanding, I only know one side of the story, was trying to solve that problem, but then came back and said, I messed up. Please forgive me. And so when I think of that just in our school systems, I think about that in our workplaces. I know a lady who lives with colitis in the bathroom a lot. Very public job. There's security cameras. Her managers were like, why are you going to the washroom all the time? We can see you on the security camera going to the washroom all the time. So jumping to that place of what's going on versus, hey, tell me what's going on. And having that conversation. I just triggered, I could go on for probably hours, just those little stories where the words we use matter so much and how they're backed up with action matters so much. And so I love that place where you're creating that dialogue. You take a pause. I don't know all the answers. If somebody on my team comes to me with something, I don't know the answer. Take a pause. Start that dialogue. So important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. To be able to take a pause and just ask someone,
Yeah.
You don't have to jump in. You don't have to know. And I don't think, and also just to be able to detach yourself a little bit from your own triggers, your own emotions, that you can take a moment to make better decisions. There's this idea in mindfulness that the stimulus and the response, you can have a little bit of a pause. So the stimulus is you seeing someone going to the bathroom a lot on the camera. Immediately, without mindfulness, the immediate reaction is call them in, judge. But with a little bit more mindfulness, a little bit more self-compassion practice, there's a little gap. There's a gap between that. And that allows that kind of communication, that allows that compassion to come through. And ultimately, what we find, what all the research shows, is that with compassionate leadership, you're going to have happier teams, more productive teams. You can see how this would work well in the workplace. I mean, less reactive people, more, more calm, more. Yeah, it's obvious that I think that this is a useful skill set for pretty much everyone, right? And I also think what's really interesting is this can be learned. You're not born compassionate or not compassionate. You can be taught these skills. They are a practice, so it's something that you need to want to learn. But I think when you start to practice for yourself and you see the benefits, you want to learn to do it more.
There's a word that comes up in my mind, and putting on that, I guess, the hat of someone who lives with an invisible condition, and I'm being very general here, but a word that keeps coming up is fear.
Mm.
And when I started putting out just a couple posts on LinkedIn and Instagram, just about my journey with Crohn's and my career and how that had massively shifted, I can't even count the amount of people who reached out to me or my wife and said, I don't have the courage that you guys have. I'm fearful. I'm fear of making others uncomfortable because, for me, I'm talking about bowel stuff. It's just is what it is. We all have it, but we don't like to talk about it. There's fear of repercussion in the workplace. There's fear of losing friends. There's so much fear wrapped around this. And we definitely need to hit on that empathetic, or sort of that compassionate leader. On the other side is any ideas, and I think you will have some insight into that idea of fear and what it does to us, but also how do we, what are your thoughts on how to overcome that fear and start sharing?
Absolutely, and a great question. And I think, this goes back to that sense of mindful dialogue and safety. I don't know if it's someone suffering from an invisible condition who feels like their job is going to be threatened by speaking up. That's not a safe environment, right? Especially if, you mentioned your friend, your colleague who was judged by going to the bathroom. That's not a safe place for her to speak up. It's up to the leaders or the managers to create that sense of safety, knowing that when they do that, they will have more productive workers. That compassionate leadership needs to be built into the organization. And then it's up to those leaders to create the safe space to allow that mindful dialogue to happen. And you can do it. Yeah. A lot of organizations. In fact, LinkedIn. I was reading about the man who started LinkedIn. His personal focus is on bringing more compassion into his leadership, and there's a lot more people trying to do this because they see the benefits. The other thing I would just touch on, and this reminds me of that, you build resilience for yourself by being self-compassionate. I mean, this is not just a one-way street. You're not just giving out to others. You're transformed as a leader if you're self-compassionate, because you can apply it to yourself. And it goes back to that sense of common humanity. Everybody suffers, everybody, right? So the leader or the manager is going to be going through stuff too. They can build up their own resilience through practicing self-compassion. And as they do that, they can then apply it to others.
Yeah, I love that you touched on resilience. And I wrote an article a while ago, actually spoke at one of our big universities here in Vancouver on this topic. And my wife and I were just thinking about resilience, and that was a topic I was given to speak on. And one of the definitions that we kind of came up with, or based on all the research we were doing, is to kind of bounce back to a pre-crisis state. And so we came up with the 3 R's. I'll link it in the bio, or in the show notes, and reflect, reframe, and reach out. It's that reflecting, that when you have even that compassion and self-compassion, it's reflecting doesn't mean like, woe is me, what's going on, but reflect on that holistic thing, whether it's you're going through a flare-up, or whether you're going through something with your partner or your kids, and then reframe it in a sense that, okay, this event has happened. I can't control this. It's going on. So what can I take out of this? What am I learning about myself? How did I show up? And did I like how I showed up? And reaching out to people. I think it's something been listening to a few podcasts on loneliness, and listened to a great sermon on this, and how we have like created the society of everything is one-way communication. Like, oh, I've got 1,000 Instagram friends, but they're not friends. I just see their life. So how do you reach out and actually create meaningful conversations with people? And aside from just talk about the weather, right? I think we all have those friends. And again, I'm generalizing. It's, you go, if there's like 5 levels to that friendship conversation, you're only at like level 1 or 2, right? You talk about the weather, you talk about your kids, and maybe you talk about your job, but that's it. You don't go any deeper than that. And I think when we talk about that resilience is, to me, it's a combination of all of that, which I think ties into compassion and building that self-compassion.
Yes, I know that from my personal practice of self-compassion, I've become much more resilient because you own your humanity. You own, the vulnerabilities, the face that you don't want to show, which everybody has. And you learn to soothe yourself through those moments. And as you soothe yourself through those moments, so you can understand other people's moments of suffering better. Would it be a good opportunity just to take a moment to practice a practice of self-compassion? Would that be?
Sure. Let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, these are two, I was going to teach just 2 practices which I use in my life and which I teach and have had, good feedback from my students. So, and they take 30 seconds. And so again, just going back to my story about bringing in just moments of pause or moments of breath into your daily life. These are micro moments of compassion. So just inviting you to put your feet on the ground. That's just important because it grounds us and connects us to the earth. So we're not just so up in our head. I like to put one hand on my heart and one hand on my belly. That's just the way I do this, but you don't need to. I like to close my eyes, but again, you don't need to. And just take 3 breaths and notice yourself settling into your body and feeling yourself breathing. And this is what I say to myself when I'm going through a moment that's challenging. And it really can be any moment. You don't have to save it for, a really difficult moment. Just you're having a difficult conversation with your child. They don't want to do something you want them to do, or whatever it is. Just say to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. You can use another word. This is a moment of difficulty, challenge, frustration, whatever it is. All humans suffer. Again, change the words. And this is my time. What do I need right now? And for me, oftentimes that's just doing this, just taking that moment to pause, put my hand on my heart, maybe love myself a bit. Maybe it's a glass of water. Maybe it's a walk. Maybe it's a deep breath. And then you can open your eyes and get on with your day. But if you sprinkle those through your day, you are building self-compassion practice. And the lovely thing about building self-compassion practice is that you build it within you, you build your own resilience within you, but it filters out from you, out to other people. And I read some research that said it filters out 5 degrees from the person who's practicing it. So as I'm practicing self-compassion to myself, I'm more likely to be compassionate to someone else. And there, in turn, I'm more likely to feel compassion to someone else. And it goes out 5 degrees from that way. So if you want to turn a workplace or want it to be more compassionate, it starts with you. Mm-hmm. Just doing this micro moment. So that's the first one that I'm suggesting. And then the second one is something that I wake up with in my day. And I say to myself, again, it takes me 30 seconds. And it's something like, I just like to settle the body because it just gets us ready. So maybe feet on the ground again. Closing the eyes, my hand on my heart, my hand on my belly. Maybe just taking a few breaths in and out to feel the breath in our body. I'm doing this to keep us present, right? So our mind comes into the breath. And you can say something to yourself like, may I be filled with kindness. May I be happy. May I be at ease. Or something like that. And again, repeating it to yourself, it really does transform your life and how you approach other people. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I know the name of your website is Find That Pause. And man, we just live such busy lives that I don't know how often I say this or people around me, I hear people say this is, I feel like I forgot to breathe today. And how important it is to find that pause through this mindful meditation, a walk, prayer, drinking some water, whatever it is, just take a pause. So we've trained, again, I'm generalizing, but I know for me, I've trained my brain to just always be on, always have an answer. Just pause. Take that breath. And then we can go about building compassionate workplaces, compassionate schools, compassionate societies. And then that, I think, will lead into building those trusting relationships and opening up places for people to share.
100%.
Yeah. Thank you for walking us through that. Thank you for sharing your practice with us. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I love just that difference between empathy and empathetic leadership versus compassionate leadership. One question I always wrap up with is, what hope and encouragement would you like to leave with our listeners today?
Just that, you can learn these practices anytime, anyone can do them, and they can transform your life for the better. You can be more content, more productive, more creative. And as you do that, so you create that around other people. Yeah.
Starts with self, right? That whole self-compassion.
It starts with you, and it can go out from you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So whether you have an invisible condition or you work with somebody who does, or a family member, maybe you're a caregiver, or maybe you think there's people around you that have something going on and you just don't know, invite somebody into a dialogue. Be authentically curious. Start that conversation. Miranda, such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I've learned a lot. You've given me a lot to think about as I start my day here in BC. We recorded this pretty early in the morning. It's given me a lot to think about as I head to the office here soon. Where can people find you? If people want to learn more about your practice, learn more about you, where can people find you?
So my website is Find That Pause, as you mentioned, findthatpause.com. So all my information is on there. I'd love to connect with more people. So sign up for my email, my newsletter. I always send out practices. So you can find me there. Thank you so much, Tim. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yes, likewise. And for those who are listening, head to invisiblecondition.com. I'll have all Miranda's information in the show notes. Also, if you've liked this episode, how really helps me and to continue this project is give us a rating on whatever platform you're on. Just give it a rating. But also, if you have feedback, if you have comments, send those to me. Head to invisiblecondition.com to the contact page. I respond to everything that comes in. If you can also find me on LinkedIn under Tim Rietsma. And again, I try to respond to everything very quickly, but I will promise to get back to you. And if you have an invisible condition and you want to learn how to share your story, connect with me. Let's talk. And I'm not an expert, but I am a champion and a cheerleader for you. So with that, everyone have an amazing day, and we'll talk to you again soon.